So I'm here to talk about Brexit, and I was specifically told to not assume that anybody knows anything about the EU, which we're all obsessed with in the UK. So just in case you don't know, and I'm not assuming that you don't, but it's made up of 28 member states now. It's grown a lot in the last 40 years. The key components of it are the single market of 500 million plus people and the customs union. Now, what is the single market? The single market has four key principles, the principles of freedom of movement for goods, services, capital and labour. And these are very important when you bear in mind the demands of the British government, which we'll come on to later. The second thing is the customs union, which means there's no tariffs within the borders of the EU. So goods, all these things that are sold in between countries in the EU don't pay any tariffs. And obviously, if the UK left, it would then have the question of will it have to pay tariffs. Now, a key thing for today's sort of discussion really is what are the drivers of the Brexit decision? Because there's Brexit and there's what led up to Brexit. We don't actually know what Brexit is yet. Nobody knows. You said it was half mysterious. It is actually a complete mystery because that is just not settled at all. But what we do know, and what we were surprised by, was what came up during the campaign for Brexit, and all the reasons, the drivers why people have voted for Brexit. These include the long-term, the blame game, which can be divided into two, sort of long-term blame game, whereby over all the time that the UK has been a member of the EU, politicians have always blamed every unpopular decision that the EU has, that people are unhappy with, on Brussels, as though Brussels is something separate, rather like the way people blame the UN for things the UN does, as though it's a separate body, when in fact it's made up of all the countries who are in it, and they influence the decision. So we've been part of that decision making, but that never comes across in the debate that actually we've embraced these decisions, and many of them were actually popular decisions, such as protections of human rights against the vagaries of government, and protections of workers' rights, social conditions. There have been quite a few things where the European Union almost has acted as a safety net, like a constitution, which the UK doesn't have a written version of, against the decisions of the government that might be considered unfair. Secondly, the blame game includes the media, and we have the media is dominated by the right-wing press in our country, which has been full of poisonous propaganda about foreigners in general for many years, but about Europe in particular. And various myths have been created, and some of them famously by Boris Johnson, who is our equivalent of Donald Trump, though not quite as extreme in his views, but just as unpredictable. But he invented the myth that Europe was forcing us to eat straight bananas. And I can honestly say in 44 years, how many years of membership there is, I've never seen a straight banana inside the EU. But these myths take hold in the media and in popular imagination and have a cumulative effect. And then secondly, there's the short-term blame game during the campaign, the social media behaviour and manipulation, some of which has come to light only the last couple of days, thanks to research from Berkeley and others on the Russian influence over Twitter during the last few days of the campaign, sending tens of thousands of tweets about perpetuating many of these myths about Brexit, because obviously it's in Russia's interest to divide Europe. Now, a key element also is the loss of control. A key message of the Brexit campaigners was to win back control. But you have to ask, what is it control of, or what are they winning control back from? And much of the analysis since the campaign has opened up many different elements to this. One is loss of control over immigration, and it is true that we've had quite a high rate of immigration, with the equivalent of a medium city's worth of population coming in every year, which has its own effect on the pressure of services on perception that the country is changing very quickly, and in some parts of the country, particularly those that are not used to having a multicultural, I mean, obviously London is one of the most multicultural places in the world, but there are many parts of the UK that are quite rural and conservative and haven't had that experience. And for them, that's something they felt there's loss of control over their identity. Their identity is disappearing. It's becoming a different type of country. And there's the other issue of loss of jobs due to automation and loss of control due to globalization, in the sense that the big corporate powers can do what they want. People like Google and Amazon, and don't pay the fair share of tax. That we don't have control anymore. That jobs are being moved around different parts of the world, and people feel if they haven't got a job, that it's because of that, or they feel that immigrants coming in and taking the jobs, which generally hasn't been. Generally, immigrants coming in have either been taking low-paid jobs that British people won't do, like picking fruit, or they're highly skilled and valued people in the NHS, for instance, which is the National Health Service. So there are complex arguments that need unpicking, but weren't unpicked very well during the campaign. Now, there was a whole issue there about the BBC's policy of having a balance, where they would give equal balance to the views of experts and facts, and people were just pushing forward an emotional view, which dismissing facts, for instance, from the OECD or wherever, as though they don't matter. It's just the OECD saying it, or they're just academic experts saying it. And because of the BBC policy of balance during an election campaign, this appeared to give a greater weight to the emotional arguments than might have been given otherwise. So there was also a regional disparity where London and the South East has accumulated a lot of wealth and jobs, but the rest of the country appears to have been left behind, apart from a few major metropolitan areas. And so there was a lot of grievances, and also a loss of faith in mainstream politics. We saw the demise of the Liberal Democrats, the most pro-European party, had 58 seats after the 2010 election, down to 8 in the next election, the one before the referendum. That enabled that weakened the moderate Tories, the Conservatives in power, and that's why Cameron made the concession about having the referendum. And that came about because the Liberal Democrats had been opposed to raising tuition fees, but had let it go ahead when they were in a coalition government. So it was actually directly related to higher education. So all sorts of complex movements going on. A lot of the demise also of the moderate left, because of a lot of feeling of betrayal by Tony Blair, because of the way the entry into Iraq went, because of concern about not being told the truth about weapons of mass destruction. And then we saw also, at about the time of the referendum, the massive influxes of refugees across Europe, getting boats from Africa, and the whole question of Merkel letting in refugees, but other countries not. And this created a whole sense of that this issue is a big issue, and everything came together in one vote. It's a particularly unhelpful way of analysing and settling your view on all these different political trends and developments in one vote on whether or not to leave the EU. So there was only a narrow victory. It was a 4% win, a 2% swing the other way would have changed it. Anything that small, the demise of the Liberal Democrats, the influence of Russians on the election campaign, the untruths during the election campaign, the referendum campaign, sorry, any of those things could have swung, if tackled a little differently, might have created that swing. So it's a very interesting political situation, and left a very divided country with lots of people waking up the next day wondering what on earth happened. And I'm sure a lot of you know what that feeling is like after a certain election here as well. But the next question is, well, is this about nationalism? And I think, what I've outlined there is it's much more complex than nationalism. Some of it is about the future. People are rejecting the future and going back to the past. There's an inevitability about globalization, automation, digital disruption, which is only going to make these factors deepen over time, and that I can't see being changed by leaving the EU at all. So it's interesting, is it nationalism that nationalism did give people a sense, some people a sense that it was now all right to voice racist views, which was very disturbing, and there was an amount of racial violence. But that may be misleading because that makes the headlines, whereas the mainstream feeling may be more applied to some of the trends that I've outlined, and may not be to do with nationalism, or it may be a different type of nationalism, in that people were rebelling against these trends of internationalism, regionalism and globalism, and the EU became the first opportunity to actually say so. In a way, it was a way of rejecting the status quo. So looking ahead, we would have to ask, well, which drivers can be attributed to nationalism, which will be reduced by Brexit, and which will be stronger after Brexit? But Brexit, what is Brexit? Theresa May was asked before the election that she called in order to create a strong and stable government, and which she lost her majority, well, Brexit is Brexit. And of course, nobody knew, because during the campaign it had been fudged. Does it mean, will we be in the single market? Will we be in the customs union? Will we be out of it altogether? So the options, I've summarized it in this way. There's, the discussion now is milling around between all these different things, because we have a cabinet in chaos, threatened by sexual scandals, by the fact that it's a minority government. It depends on a hardline unionist party in Northern Ireland to pass anything through, but it's facing rebellion by lots of, a small number of its MPs, but that's enough to prevent the grand process of all these, the bill of setting the process for coming out of the EU that's just going through Parliament this week. It's just starting, and I think it's had hundreds of motions of amendments that it's facing. And it really would be one of the most challenging bills ever to get through in the history of Parliament. But the options on offer are hard Brexit, or what some people call a cliff edge, or what I call a dog's Brexit, where you have no deal and you just come out of the EU and then hope for the best, and then you have to set up all your trade deals. There's the idea of a hard Brexit later, where you have a transition period, which some people think could be sort of 18 months to 2 years, and some people think might last indefinitely, because you might never be ready to go beyond that. You have a soft Brexit, which is the key difference, which the moderates in the Conservative Party want, which is staying in the single market and in the customs union. So you'd lose your say over how things are done, but you could still be in there and benefit from economically from being in a market of 500 million people. There is debate about whether some people might just want to be in the customs union, some might want to be in the single market and customs union. And there's the idea of a soft Brexit later, where you want soft Brexit, but you still need a transition period. And then there's the very distinct possibility that you might, in the end, have no Brexit at all, because they won't be able to pass the bills through, and that eventually public opinion will change. This is what Remain as hope, but actually opinion has been fairly stubbornly unchanged, only changed slightly. And although the victory for Brexit was only slight, you would have to have a very significant change in public opinion really to justify not going ahead with what the referendum called for. So democratically. So let's move on to what's at stake for higher education. There are huge risks involved for higher education. Universities get a huge amount of money from Europe. 1/5 of all EU money going into the UK is for research, development and innovation. Universities get 16% of their research income from the EU, second only to Germany. There's a 3.4 billion euro net benefit to the UK from the large EU research programme Horizon 2020. And in that, the money that we get from that, some 40 or more universities get 20% of their total income from their Horizon 2020 funding. So it's very significant. Some universities get as much as 50% of their grant money from the EU. And the key thing also to remember is that the UK is very strong on science, very strong on research universities, as you'll know by the rankings, generally second only to the US cumulatively. And it plays a very influential role in the Horizon 2020 projects, where it coordinates about 20% of the projects. So it gets the extra income from that and the extra influence from that, which it couldn't do, most people think, if it left the EU. But also there's the European Research Council funding. It gets 33% of all humanities and social sciences funding to the UK comes from that. So, but I'll move on. Also at stake is the Erasmus Plus study and work program, which 231,000 UK students have used over the years since 1987, 15,000 a year typically now, and the number of, the second thing is the number of staff, number of students and staff in the UK. But I'll come on to that in a bit. What we're seeing is that there'll be there would have been a huge opportunity post Brexit from 2020 in the next research programme for the EU, which is going to be it could be up to 160 billion euros. So there's a lot of money on offer that the UK may miss out of completely. The EU yet doesn't know what the UK wants. It could try to buy into these programmes, but it's not clear if it would accept the precondition of free movement of EU citizens, getting back to one of the founding principles. And we know this from the example of Switzerland, which was suspended from the EU research programmes and the student programmes when it had a referendum which blocked free movement. And it was only allowed back in when it made this compromise which allows free movement but prioritises Swiss applications for jobs. So the UK would have to come up with some pretty good new ideas in order to stay in. And the EU is saying there can be no, we don't know if it's just a negotiating tactic, but they're saying there can be no cherry picking of which parts of the EU you stay in. So the question is, what can it, where else can it go? What non-EU opportunities are there? There was recently an agreement signed on science with the US, which may show the way forward. And Scientists for EU, the main campaigning group, suspects that what the UK will do is try and put more money into the research into the big European projects, of which the EU is a part funder, but they're not solely EU. So things like CERN, the European Organisation for Nuclear Research, or the European Space Agency, and the European Bioinformatics Institute. So there are huge risks for the UK, and in terms of student mobility, this is also a problem, because 14% of our students are from the EU. And as you see there, the number of EU students has suddenly fallen. I think you're seeing a fall here in recruitment as well, a similar situation. And they don't know, no students who want to come here, no EU students know what the situation will be like in several years' time. So it is a real problem. That's a real disincentive to come, that they don't know, because the issue hasn't been settled, will their rights as citizens be maintained? Students, I'm going to race ahead. Staff mobility, the same problem. 16% of researchers are from EU, and we have 40,000 EU staff in our universities, all of whom can't plan whether to buy a house. Lots of them thinking of going back. They don't feel welcome. There's an emotional aspect to this, because the EU is not just all these things, the single market and the customs union. It's a set of relationships, it's a process, it's a way of living, where it's family, where the response after the referendum really was amongst EU citizens. It felt like they'd been turned away by their own family, and that they may have to leave. And other aspects are, it may open up opportunity for expanding our transnational education. I went to a conference recently, the UK, where they're talking about building campuses, branch campuses in Europe, but again, that would depend on the terms of trade agreements. And I think the key thing to bear in mind is that the scholarship and research flourish in, as the British Academy has said, in long-term, stable and interconnected frameworks that support people, collaboration, resources and regulation. And EU membership has provided such frameworks, and now there's a big question mark about what will happen next. So lastly, I'd just like to say, rushing ahead, that the key question now is the details of the deal, what's actually going to happen. But even if it doesn't happen, I think universities need to face up to how do they address what was going on in the election campaign, all those drivers, because many of those drivers will not be addressed by leaving the EU. Many of the feelings of loss of control are only going to get greater because the UK will be weaker in its position in trying to influence the world and trying to get the right deal. And universities may realise that they need to do more about ensuring equitable access, ethical standards such as not using tax havens to stash their money, which has been revealed recently, and listening to local people and helping them set the agenda of university research, and also, crucially, in making sure that not only that they understand, not only that they increase internationalization, not just for the people who go abroad, but for the students who are at home, not only doing that, but that ordinary people, not necessarily the ones at the university, understand why or how all these international students coming in, whether it's from the EU or elsewhere, how that benefits them, which is a point I'd leave you to think about. Thank you. Okay.